And one. Well, hey, Dave Melinda here, Positive Polarity Podcast. I hope things are going awesome for you this week. I love starting with a question. And this is more of a rhetorical question because you'll already know the answer. And, we talk about growth all the time. We talk about growing on purpose. We talk about business growth. We talk about intentional growth. And so it's so funny because when you want to grow something outside, you plant it, then you water it, then you let the sun hit it, and then basically it grows. I mean, there's this kind of this roadmap. Well, I know somebody that says there's actually a map to success, and he's open today to share that with us. So I'm honored to be hanging out with Scott Ritzheimer. How are you today, sir?
Dave, I'm doing quite well. I'm excited to be here. It's really cool. A podcast actually completely changed my life, changed my business, changed my life, actually changed my profession. And so, right at this moment, it gets me every single time. There's this moment of like, this could be that for someone, and I get really excited about it.
That's awesome. I am so excited to hang out with you today. You're the founder and CEO of Scale Architects. Now, when I heard that, I'm like, my construction background, my ears are peaked up right away because I'm like, oh my gosh, this guy's an architect. So fill us in on Scale Architects because I don't think it is what people think it is on the surface. So fill us in on what that is.
Yeah, we are not building architects, we are business architects. We work with nonprofits as well, but a lot of folks, particularly in the small, medium-sized business space, do what I did early on, and that is that we're really good at whatever it is that we do, and we do a lot more of it. We try and train a few people around us on how to do it, and we give more and more of our energy to working in our business, to doing what it is that we do, that we neglect working on our business. And we have to move, much like the move from building to designing. You just can't like hack your way to a scalable organization. At some point, there's actually a very specific point, but at this specific point, we have to shift from, hey, we're just going to drive this thing to success, to we are going to design this thing for success. And that's what we help folks do. We help them make that pivot from, the sweat and tears and effort that it takes to get something up off the ground and start to build a much more scalable, much more sustainable, much more enjoyable business to lead.
Wow, that's fantastic. So I don't know if you remember Kevin Costner in Field of Dreams when he said, if you build it, they will come. Is that like, I mean, I guess when I was listening to you, I was thinking about that. It just because you have an idea, just because you have a business, it doesn't necessarily mean everybody's going to flock to you. Do you buy into that as well? Or is it just an
Yeah.
automatic open your doors and people automatically start coming to you?
No, not a chance. In fact, the vast majority of the time, whatever it is you think you're going to do is going to fail miserably before you find out what will actually work, right? If we were Kevin Costner, right, we would build it and then we'd build it and then we'd build it and then they might come.
Sure. Yep.
And so when you look at this early part of the process, this entrepreneurial stage, it's marked by more setbacks and defeats and failure than most people experience in 2 lifetimes, all crammed into about 2 or 3 years. The first year is this kind of blissful, it starts blissful, like, hey, this is all going to be wonderful. I've got this great idea. Everyone's going to run to it, followed by crickets, right? Like nobody runs to it. It's just, and we try for about a year to hang on to it. We realize this isn't going to work the way we thought it was going to work. And we realize we're going to have to pivot some major part of our idea about our business. Maybe not the product, maybe the delivery or the client or something, but we realize there is a fundamental error in how we saw this thing working. And a lot of folks miss that and they just hang on to it and they hang on to it and they hang on to it. And that's why a lot of organizations fail. Next stage of this process is really tough because what we thought we knew, we realize we don't know. And now we're a little shaken because we realize we didn't know it. Like there's a whole lot more to this that we don't know than what we did know. And at the same time, we're running out of cash. right? It's not, folks who are starting businesses are not sitting on mountains and mountains and mountains of cash to do whatever they want with, right? They're scraping quarters out of their cushions and hoping they can make it. And so that second year is really, really tough. It's the hardest of the 3-year kind of boot cycle, if you will, of a new business, because you're actually getting more traction, but it feels like you're getting less accomplished because you're so much more aware of what's not working than you were before. And that's why one of the key traits of someone who will be one day founder, right? If you don't know it, or if you're not there yet, or if you're in the middle of it and wondering if you have what it takes, it's resilience. There's just a degree of resilience that successful founders have, and it's in every one of their stories. There is a deep, dark challenge, right? Especially getting off the ground, but it actually comes back again, and it's deeper and darker a little bit later in the process as well. And so one of the silver lining about this early stage is that the stakes are relatively low when we can pass that first test of resilience. And so if you have that, you have the resilience, you push through that second year, that's where you start to see little glimpses of the light at the end of the tunnel, right? You start, this is working a little bit. If you're a coach, you've actually got a couple of people who called you instead of you calling them. You've got a couple of people who are renewing and it's starting to build. Or if you're a hair salon, right? You get someone in and they start telling their friends, and it's not just all hustle, right? It's hustle all day, but some other things are working as well. And you slowly but surely start to climb your way out. But that's not at all the picture that we paint on social media of entrepreneurism, right? It's this like, hey, you do it for freedom and then you sit on the beach and sip, 2 pina coladas and sing Garth Brooks songs. Doesn't really work that way. Doesn't mean it's not worth doing, but when you look at it, it's a lot harder than most of us think.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you what, that's a great point, Scott. Think about the 4-Hour Work Week, a book called The 4-Hour Work Week, and I never read it, so I don't want to say it's right or wrong. Just the title, though, is, can lead people to think, man, I only got to work, 1 hour a day, and I can take Fridays off. I mean, there's obviously, I think, a lot of misnomers about being an entrepreneur. And I think that's one of them, like we talked about.
100%. I think that we misinterpret the 4-hour work week. And when you look at the 4-hour work week, one, there's a component of time, right? You have to work to not work. Yeah, so there's a piece of that. The other part of it is just when you're doing it. You don't start with the 4-hour work week, right? And that's not really even what he's saying. It's a shock jock type of title. It's not at all the point of it, but it has created or been part of creating this culture of you can have a business and it doesn't cost you anything. And it's just not true.
Yeah. Well, so I want to circle back to your starting out, Scott, because most people have had to go through and endure before they were able to, teach it, learn from it. So kind of share with us, what was your first entrepreneurial journey? What did that look like for you?
Yeah. So first one and the real one are probably different answers because I'd started a couple of businesses when I was a kid, mowing lawns and doing stuff like that. So sure. First kind of real business in the real world, total accident. Didn't mean to do it at all. I was a part-time employee. I was working at a ministry and just needed to pay the bills. And the company I was working for part-time was actually sold while I was working there, owner financed. It was a small business, sold, owner financed, and then systematically but unintentionally destroyed. Just awful over about 18-month period. And as that time was going through, I stayed in touch with the original founder, and I was still working there this whole time. And I learned more over that 18 months than I did 5-10 years later when I actually went to business school, just to kind of check that box. Sure. And I learned a lot of what not to do, right? How not to treat your employees, how not to spend money, how not to buy a business, right? How not sure. to treat your clients. I learned a whole lot of things that these really well-meaning, wonderful gentlemen who bought the company just did not get right. Sure. And so fast forward to the end of this, it's August 2008. very end of August, and the original founder gets a call from the buyers, and they say, "Hey, we've done everything we can to make this work. Not only is it not working, it's dragging our other company down. We can't do it. We're going to declare bankruptcy. If you want to get your stuff back before we do, you're welcome to it." Now, at this point, it's like 3 broken computers and one of those office chairs where all the padding is gone from the middle. You know what I mean? That's kind of all that's left. But it was more the blessing to say, hey, if you want to, fire up the website again and give it a shot, you've got our blessing to do that. They said, you got 24 hours. So he's like, okay, and he calls me from the U-Haul on the way up to pick up these computers and chair. I don't even know why he drove up there, but to do the handshake, and I think they signed a couple documents to make it official. And he calls me and says, hey, Scott, will you help me relaunch this thing? I think we can give it a go. Will you come on as an owner and help me do it? And so that's how I ended up being a co-founder in the relaunch of this business, was through that. And again, August 2008, which means our first month in business was September 2008. Not a great time to start a business. Not a great time at all. And I went from making a little over minimum wage at the time. I think it was like 10 or 11 bucks. So it was more than minimum wage, but about 11 bucks an hour to making $0 an hour. That was my introduction to entrepreneurism, is you go from making very little money to none. Stock market drops 30 some odd points in the first 6 months that we're in business. And then we started to realize it was slightly different than other stories, because we had an idea of what the model was, but what we didn't have an idea of was how much work hadn't been done. They had deleted all the code from our website, so we had no website. Our phone number wasn't working properly. There were about 200 customers that had paid but not been served yet. There was about $150,000 in short-term debt that hadn't been paid to vendors. It was just a mess. So our first year was an unraveling of all of this mess that had happened over the past 18 months, and it was really hard. Frankly, it was a lot of fun because we were finally in control again. We had been through such a difficult period of just being out of control, both he and I, that it was really cool to just say, hey, we can steer this thing now. We may not work, but we can steer it. Probably about 7-8 months later, I got my first paycheck. I think it was like $18. Not really, but it was almost nothing. And but it was like a sign that, like, hey, I think this thing can work. I really think this can work. And fast forward, the thing just worked. The phone started ringing. We rehired a couple of employees. It wasn't long before we had 7 or 8 employees, all working from the co-founder's basement, by the way, to take any glamour out of this, getting letters from the HOA, the whole thing. And I caught myself, his job was the sales side of things. My job was to manage the team. And I caught myself in this stage of like, I don't have time to tell you everything to do. You've got to do your job so I can do my job. I have more than enough to do. Thank you. Yeah. And I was frustrated by it, right? I was just so frustrated by the needs of my team members. And I found that so many founders end up in that same place, right? They're trying to get their work done. The more people you have, the more stuff you have to do. Right? We think we're going to bring in a couple of employees and it's going to make our life easier because they take stuff off of our plate, but more stuff comes on. You got to sell more to pay for them, and they need help from us, right? They need training, they need direction, they need guidance, and it just puts us in what feels like an impossible position. I don't have time to do all of your stuff or help you with all of your stuff and do my stuff. And especially as a young entrepreneur, I mean, the first leadership team meeting I was ever in, I led. I had no idea what I was doing. It was a really difficult phase in a time that should have been really glorious because we were growing. Like you look at the numbers, the kind of vanity metrics, and it seems like it's everyone's dream. Yeah. But inside, I'd wake up every day thinking, what's wrong with these people? What is wrong with these people? Yeah. So ended up figuring out some of those challenges. Finally, actually through a few books that I read, learned that I needed to embrace management. I didn't have to become the best manager in the world, but my role now wasn't to be the business, it was to manage the business. That was a pretty big change for me. Set the stage for another kind of extraordinary sprint of growth. We went about 5 years from that point, doing high double-digit growth every single year. We were doubling every couple of years,
Nice.
and it was awesome. It was really hard, breathless sprint every single week, right? But it was working really well. We served thousands of different businesses and nonprofits during this stage that were starting. And so from an impact perspective, an income perspective, it seemed like everything was up and to the right. It's going to be awesome.
Wow. That is so cool. So I have a question because I think about the map, and if there's a map to success, there's usually along the way, there's like benchmarks, right? What would like the first benchmark be? What's our first stop on that roadmap to success? If somebody's listening and they are, whether they're new to the entrepreneurial journey, maybe they have a business that they've, tried for years and they're struggling with it. What do you, when you look at your map to success, what do you feel like is where do we start? Where's that first spot where we're starting from, Scott?
It's a fantastic question that far too few people ask. And the reason why we don't ask is because we can't actually see it, right? When you look at the different milestones and benchmarks along the way, they're mostly invisible for founders, right?
Okay.
It's a little different than other leadership journeys. For example, let's take an employee. Let's take the leadership journey of an employee. You start off similar to what I did, kind of at the front line of the organization, doing the work that needs to get done. You do a great job and someone notices and they think, hey, I think this person's got potential. They should lead a team. And so you step up into a team lead role. That's a really tough transition to make for a lot of people, right? But they have the advantage as an employee of somebody validating that externally. You get a new title or new responsibilities, hopefully new paid, but not always. But there's something outside of you and your own experience that validates why that's so hard, right? And still a lot of people don't make it, but again, they can see that it's changed. They can see they've got a new role, they've got a new. But for founders, right, what's the title on every founder's business card when they first start off? It's founder and CEO. Or janitor is what should be on there, but founder and CEO. Right? Yeah, and so what happens though, and you're right, the janitors is probably more realistic, but we go through 5 distinct stages before we actually become a CEO. And when do those happen? Like, what change precipitates this different stage? How does it work? And so in reflecting back on my own story and looking at these thousands of entrepreneurs that I'd helped, I started to recognize that there were these key points, right, that were happening over time. There were these key demarcation lines. There were key stages that defined how we needed to show up for success. And to answer your question, the very first one actually happens before what we would think of the very first one. Very first one that happens is when you reach this stage that I call the dissatisfied employee, right? You're sitting there in your job one day and think, I can't do this for another day. I can't, there's gotta be something else. And maybe it's for, you want more freedom. This is a really popular one among visionaries. Maybe you've got a bigger vision for your life. Maybe you're just bored in the work that you're doing. But when you look at every founder's story, if you really get down into the details of the story, what starts it off is this moment of dissatisfaction somewhere else. Now, not all of them are employees, but a lot of them are. And a lot of them are succeeding and they're still not satisfied. And that's actually the first stage of the entrepreneurial journey. Again, it's what I call the dissatisfied employee. And to help illustrate these different stages, because they're invisible, I like to compare them to maybe a position in a sports infrastructure, if you will. And it's like being a trainee on the sideline. What we tend to by not recognizing that the journey starts there before you ever start, what happens is the frustration and dissatisfaction that we feel compels us to start a business as soon as we possibly can. And it robs us of the opportunity to learn the things that we need to learn to create a successful business as soon as we can. And so what we need to do is make sure that we recognize there is a stage that happens before we launch, right? There are things that you need to do before you launch to, one, find out should you really launch, right? Two, find out when you launch, will it actually work? You can actually prove a lot of that before you launch, and it's a lot less painless. Or it's a lot less painful. And the best thing about it is you get to do it on someone else's dime. Someone else is paying your payroll, right? Other people might be, if you're mentoring or training, other folks will show you the way, right? And the stakes are so much lower than if you try and skip that stage and jump right in. And Dave, you're muted.
Thank you. Sorry about that. I want to make sure that we kind of get this distinction, because there are some unhappy people in corporate America, I'll say, and I want to be careful, because I want your opinion on this. Just because I'm unhappy with where I'm at, that doesn't necessarily mean it's a green light to go start something, is it? What are your thoughts on that?
You are 100% right. Just because you're a dissatisfied employee doesn't mean that you're ready to start a business. Here's the way that you find out. And it's not always easy, and a lot of folks won't take the risk to do this. But my question is, why would you not take the risk to do this and then take a bigger risk to start a business? There's lots of reasons why we can be unhappy in our job. One, it's just not a good fit, right? Or it's not a good fit anymore. We've got a bad boss. We've got a bad culture. Those are not reasons to start your own business. So here's what separates dissatisfied employees who are, I would say, are pre-entrepreneur versus dissatisfied employees who just need to get a better job. And that is, if you get a better job, for folks that don't have that necessary drive to be an entrepreneur, when you get a better job, you feel better. But for entrepreneurs, even when they get a better job, even when things are going well, there's this dissatisfaction that they can't resolve.
Yeah. Wow. That's really, there's a lot of wisdom in that, Scott. And I want to take a quick break. And when we come back, I really want to unpack that, because I think that we have a lot of people listening around the world that are in that spot where they want to try something. And I always tell people there's no right or wrong way to do it. But I love the distinction between the dissatisfaction of not liking your job. And I think that there's maybe only one thing that'll scratch that itch, and that's owning that. So when we come back, I want to unpack that real quick. Awesome. I'm honored to be hanging out with Scott Ritzheimer, the founder and CEO of Scale Architects. And we are right now in the middle of this dissatisfaction discussion. And I love this, because I think it would be so easy. The easy way out would be to say, I don't like my job, therefore I want to start a new job. But the harder piece is starting that entrepreneurial journey. And I was going to ask you, when you started your journey, were you married where you had mouths to feed, or was it just you where it was like, hey, if it didn't work, it's not the end of the world? Because I think there's a vast difference between those two pieces. And I'm just curious where you were in your personal journey.
I was relatively newly married, and we had done a couple of things that really helped out. Again, because our focus at the time was our work on ministry, we weren't actually all that dependent on my income. And that's why I was able to work for relatively cheap. My wife worked as well at the time. And it was a whole lot different than when I jumped in and started my second business later in my career and had mouths to feed. That was a different animal. Yep. And so her income, and we actually, for full transparency, we had bought a house, And we renovated the basement and we moved into the basement and rented out the top 2 levels so that we could keep our expenses as low as possible. So we did a lot early in our marriage and in this story to limit our expenses as much as possible, which ultimately gave us the freedom to do that. If I was sitting on a mortgage and we'd had kids by then, I never would have been able to take up the opportunity. Wouldn't be possible.
Yeah. That's awesome. And I just want, again, people to realize that everybody is in a different position. And I don't think there's any one right or wrong way to to go from corporate America to entrepreneurism, if that's a word. But I think the dissatisfaction that you were talking about, Scott, is really smart, because that's got to be a really hard distinction, because now emotions are involved. There's some stress involved. There's that escape. Hey, anything's better than where I'm at. So how do you counsel somebody that might be listening that is trying to decide, is this journey right for me or not?
Yeah, it's so I have to preface this to say I love entrepreneurism, right? I've done it multiple times. I've helped probably more entrepreneurs than the vast majority of people ever. And my suggestion to anyone asking me, should I start a business, is no, you shouldn't. If you can do anything else, it's easier, go do it. Right? Yeah. If you can get another job, just go get another job. If you can find have a conversation with your boss and make your current job better, if you can do anything other than start a business, do it. I firmly believe that. If you try that once or twice and you still can't get by, you still it's not enough, that's when you know it's time to go.
I mean, so I think about it for myself, and I've only worked for myself for my whole career, so I don't know how people look at this, but I almost feel like we're saying I can't play well with others. I'm not, I have this mold that I'm either not hireable. I mean, there's got to be this weird feeling, should I stay or should I go, type of scenario. And when you help people, they've got to be kind of nervous. I'm assuming there's a lot of people that have fear and stress that are kind of walking before they run, or do most of the people just start and run full bore and never look back?
So there's a few things that drive that. You like DISC. I'm a big personality style guy as well, and we use something called the synergist model. But there's different ways that people are wired that drives that. Sure. There's different stages of life that drive that. There's different degrees of capital, padding, if you will, that drive that. There's a lot of factors that go into that. The vast majority of the folks that I work with are visionaries, right? They're high caliber, it's all octane, just light the thing on fire and go. So the biggest challenge that they have is going too soon. Right? They make the leap too soon. They don't, and then they have to learn the hard way. And to their credit, they do it. They make it through, and they push. For other folks, they might get stuck polishing the apple. Right? They're sitting there and they're thinking about it. I don't think fear has anything to do with. It's not a qualifying criteria. If you're afraid of starting your business, that's a good sign. If it causes. Most of the time when we face fear, we run away from it because, our brains are built to run away from bears, but your business is not a bear. It's not going to eat you. It's not trying to kill you. And so I'll always say fear is fundamentally flawed, right? Because it'll keep you from doing your best work, but it's incredibly useful because if you feel fear, it actually means you're onto something. Doesn't mean you got the right thing yet, but it's actually an indication that you're moving in the right direction. And so when I'm looking at it, that dissatisfaction is so important because it has nothing to do with confidence, or it has nothing to do with fear, has nothing to do with charisma. It's that, and here's, again, another way of separating those who are kind of pre-founder from those who are just miserable is the defining question for folks is not how do I how do I get rid of the boss? The king is dead, long live the king. That's not it. It's that might be a symptom, but the real question they're asking is, isn't there a better way? Right? When you look at folks who, and I typically work with folks who are not solopreneurs, right? These are folks that either have started and have grown to a point where they're a bigger organization, or some are very ambitious and they say, hey, I know out of the gate, I'm not doing the solopreneur thing. Sure. And to a T, virtually every single one of them, whether they did it consciously or unconsciously, found themselves asking the question, isn't there a better way? Isn't there a better way to treat our employees? Isn't there a better way to go after this market? Isn't there a better product that I can build, or a better service I can give? And that, you can see how different that is, right? There's growth built into that. There's improvement built into that. Whereas a lot of folks who are just miserable employees are trying to escape something. You see, successful founders, by and large, move to something, right? Creating that better way, as opposed to trying to run from something in their past.
Wow. That's a really fundamental question, I think, that needs to get asked early is, are you running away from something, or are you running to something? Because I think it's hard though, that's a tough question, because if I say I'm running away from something, now I'm forced to kind of deal with that. That's gotta be tough. I mean, do you see a lot of people in your work, Scott, that are running from something, or are most of people actually running to something?
I would say the majority are running from. I think that's a big part of why you see most new startups fail.
What is the research on that?
It's all over the map. It depends on who you ask. There are numbers that range from 60% to 90%, and then just about everything else is anecdotal. When you look at most of the 60% figures come from tax bureaus, either the IRS or Her Majesty's government in the UK. That's where a lot of those 60 some odd percent numbers come from. But you and I know there's a lot of businesses that start that never make it to tax filing, right? Yeah. They never make any money. It never really gets off the ground. So the real failure rate is significantly higher than the tax rate of, the tax failure rate of 60%. So most of the time, I've seen it's about 80% of business owners who say, hey, I'm starting a business. It doesn't matter what formal steps they take. And the first stage of my career, we were doing those formal steps with people. So that was a big part of our process. It doesn't matter what the formal steps are. It matters if you're still doing that business 5 years later, and 4 out of 5 are not.
Oh, well, and I think that really brings up a good point. If you're listening and the realization is 80% of the businesses that start fail, then it's kind of like standing at the plate and striking out 8 out of 10 times. You need a hitting coach, right? I mean, if you're just missing the ball every time. So where does Scale Architects come into this, Scott? Where do you guys help somebody that might be listening in that journey? What do you guys typically do for those people?
Yeah, to talk about what we do, you've actually got to fast forward a couple of stages. There's a lot of folks who do wonderful work in this early stage, this dissatisfied employee stage, and even in the second stage, which is where we take the leap, right? So you asked about milestones. The gateway to stage 2 is when you go full-time for your business. And that's where you move from dissatisfied employee to startup entrepreneur. You go from being a trainee, right, trying to figure out how the game is played, to moving into the game and actually playing it yourself.
Okay.
And I don't want to get hung up here because I want to answer your question, but there are a couple of stages that happen. We go from this star player mode, and let's say we do it really well. We're a great hairdresser, we're a great roofer, we're whatever it is that you do. And you realize we got a lot of work coming in, I need to hire some help. And it usually happens around the time that you've hired a handful of people, right? It's a very scientific term. But somewhere between 5 and 10, you feel there's something like you can actually tell that it's different. The demands on your time shift, and you realize it's not about what you get done anymore. right? You're not a roofer anymore. You're a manager, right? You're managing roofers. And again, it usually happens between 5 and 10 employees or full-time equivalents if you do virtual work or whatever it may be. And we start wrestling with that question I mentioned in my intro of what's wrong with these people, or, and we've got to learn how to do that. And that's where we tend to start coming in as scale architects, is in that third stage where we've moved beyond star player mode. We've moved beyond being a solopreneur. We've got a small team, and now we've got to really figure out how to lead this thing. It's not about what we do anymore, even though that plays a big role in it. It's our highest leverage is how we have success through others. And that's where we start to partner up with founders and help them to make that evolution. And here's why this is so important. There's something that I call the star player paradox. And basically what it is the more effective you are as a star player, as that startup entrepreneur, the more effective you are as a coach, the more brilliant you are as a musician, the harder it is to step up into a role managing other coaches or other musicians or other roofers or whatever it may be. And so what we tend to do is work with really highly skilled, highly competent founders who are frustrated with their team and feel like they're spinning their wheels, they're working harder than ever, and they're keeping less money than ever.
Wow. So when you're moving beyond that solopreneur where you're starting to assemble a team, that's where you guys jump in then. And I'm assuming, like, I work with a lot of people that are really good at their craft. Like you said, they're really good at their trade. They're really good, but boy, ask them how to build a team, or ask them how to improve the customer's experience, or ask them how to increase their profit margin. Those are really hard questions because their whole career, a lot of times, Scott, has been focused on, that piece of equipment or, whatever that service they're doing. That's got to be how do you help somebody move from looking down to looking up, like you said before, working in the business versus working on? Is that a long process for a lot of people?
It isn't actually. It is and it isn't. So this is something that we are constantly evolving into, but you can make dramatic improvements in a very short period of time. So the reason why we work in this stage and why folks come to us is usually that they're just here, right, with everything. It's like, and then they're and they don't know if they can kick up for another breath. They just feel like they're always underwater. They're always behind. There's not enough time in the day. There's no one that they can rely on to get this stuff done. And it just feels like just this whole world of catch-22s. And it's really, really hard because it doesn't feel like it should be really, really hard. Right? The early stage is hard, and we kind of feel, we recognize, okay, I understand, I'm building something from nothing, that should be hard. Yeah. But then we have this period where it just seems to work really well, and then it gets really hard again, and that's really confusing for folks. Yeah. And it feels like when you do the right things that you're doing the wrong things, and so you go out and you start looking for help, and everyone has a million ideas on what you should be, right? This is what leadership is, this is what you should be doing, this is what a CEO does with their time. But in fact, there's actually only a couple of things that you need to do at this stage. The first thing that you need to do to get your head back above water and start making progress is realize that the I game is over. It's not about what you do anymore. You have to stop thinking in terms of I and start thinking in terms of we. Really practical example. Again, let's say you're a roofer and there's this really special procedure that you need for cutting it just the right way. I show you how much I know about roofing, but you know how to do it better than anyone else can do it, and you're sitting there thinking, I just don't have time to do that. But then you're thinking, I don't have time to train anyone else to do that. And so our measuring stick, rightly so, because it was what was necessary in stage 2, but our measuring stick gets stuck on what is the fastest route for me to be done with that. And I'll just do it myself.
Yep.
But if we start to recognize what is the fastest route for us to be done with that, not just today, but tomorrow and the next day and the next day, it changes your priorities dramatically. And so when we can start changing those priorities, we can start getting past the reluctance that we have on spending time doing training or this stuff that feels like it's not moving us forward. That's when we can start to have breakthrough. So you got to make the shift from I to we. You have to learn just some basic management skills. Right? You are now responsible. Your primary occupation is not whatever your occupation is. It is managing a team that does that. So if you're a doctor, your primary responsibility is not seeing patients, although you probably still do a lot of that at this stage. Sure. Your primary responsibility is building a team that creates a phenomenal patient experience, right? And you see, and doctors are a great example of this, how many times have you had a bad experience with a receptionist at a doctor's office, right? A lot. How many times have you had a bad experience with a billing department for a doctor's office? All the time. How many times have you had this wonderful doctor that you love, but everyone else in the office is just awful? I mean, it's happened so many times in my life. Because they're stuck there, right? They're stuck in that reluctant manager. They think, I just need to see more patients. That's how I make more money. When in fact, what they need to do is they need to build a better experience and they need to build a better team. And so those are two really big things, is building the team. How do you do that? How do you get the right people? And how do you learn to manage the right people well? You don't have to learn to manage the wrong people well. You just have to learn to manage the right people well. And then the third thing that you need to do is you actually need to bring somebody else into what I'd call your inner circle. You have to find a second in command. You've got to find someone. It might just be a VA who's awesome. It might be your director of operations. It might be your COO. I don't care what you call them. There's someone who can walk alongside you and carry some of the weight of leading this organization, who can bear some of the management responsibility with you. Not all of it, but some of it. And what I've found, if you can do those things, if you can make the mindset shift, if you can start building the right team of people to create a great customer experience, and then you get a second in command who can split, divide and conquer with you, right? Sales, ops, or whatever it might be.
Yep.
Those organizations just take off. It is not uncommon for those organizations to double in a year. I've seen it too many times to think anything else. And it goes to show, it's just one example of 7, you don't have to do everything. You don't have to be good at everything. You don't even have to be good at what you do anymore, right? You've just got to be good at thinking in terms of I, not we, building the right team to create a great experience, and finding a second in command and working well with them.
Wow, those are really powerful. They almost seem like, I don't want to say common sense, but they seem like too simple. I was expecting this big, journey on this map of, oh my gosh, these are so simple, but yet they're so brilliant when you start thinking about the I versus the we, and you start thinking about some basic management and leadership opportunities and skills, and then to think about bringing somebody else in. I wanted to ask you, as we start to land the plane today, like is it hard for an average entrepreneur to bring someone else in, because it's like that's their baby and you're all of a sudden dating my daughter type thing? I mean, how do you help people with that? Because that to me would seem to be the hardest of those 3.
You are 100% right. And so there's this problem with the English language, right? And that we conflate simple and easy. Mm-hmm. Those are not the same thing, right? Sure. Most things that are simple to understand are actually really hard to do. And so I think it was Kierkegaard said this about Christianity. He said, Christianity used to be something that was easy to understand and difficult to do. But we have made it something that is very difficult to understand and easy to do.
Wow.
And we do the same thing as entrepreneurs. We go after the strategies and we make things more complicated to avoid doing the real work. And so it is simple in terms of there's only 3 things you have to do. It's really hard because those 3 things are not easy to do. We're rewiring your brain to get you to think in terms of I instead of we. You're probably saying goodbye to a couple of team members to get the right team members on board. You're probably stepping into more work on hiring than you're comfortable doing because you've got your real work to do. And by the way, you still have all your real work to do while you're trying to do all of this. It's not like you have the luxury of just not doing anything other than these three things. You still have your role to play. And you're right, the hardest of the three is, how do you find someone that you can trust? And that's actually the key word. You don't need someone who is, you actually don't even need someone who's an A player. That's actually a misleading direction. You need someone that you can trust. You need someone that you can trust, not always to have every single answer or to do everything exactly the way that you would. You need someone to trust that they will throw up their hand when they don't know what to do. That's actually what you need. Because if you can trust that if you don't hear from them, everything's okay, and that you will hear from them if something isn't, the freedom that creates for you to focus on your area, right? Whether it be sales or marketing or relationships. It's just, for someone who doesn't have it yet, they wouldn't believe the words that I would use to describe it. And so it's not about hiring some amazing person. It's about hiring someone that you can trust. That's why you actually see a lot of people get through this stage without ever knowing that they did it, because they intuitively get that. So what I really counsel folks on doing is, yes, we need to design that role. And yes, there's some stuff that you're going to have to let go of, and we're going to work on that. But it's way easier to let go of it to somebody that you trust. And so the very most important thing is, don't just pull the next person in. Find someone that you deeply trust. Build processes that enable that trust. And then consistently and repeatedly pour into communication and continuing to build that relationship, because fundamentally that's where you'll find your trust for the long term.
Well, and I think that's really hard for people to do, is to just keep pouring in. You almost feel like, hey, you're certified. Now go back to work, right? Like, hey, excuse me, I tried this with my wife once. I said, hey, I told you on our wedding day that I loved you, and if something changes, I'll let you know, right? I mean, didn't work well then, doesn't work well now. But yet we have that mentality as leaders that, no news is good news for them. If I walk by and don't yell at them, they think, wow, this is awesome.
Yeah.
So it's a fundamental shift, I think, Scott, for people to actually realize that I have to invest in my people, and then invest again tomorrow, and then invest again the next day.
Yeah,
This is not just a one and done type thing. Is
it
that a
is.
big blind spot for people that you work with, do you think?
Yeah, I think so. And what the second in command does is actually helps you to invest in a person as opposed to a whole company, right? Because it's just so hard to make that leap going from not much to 10 people. You're just going to spread it out too thin. It's not really going to work. By building that relationship and getting it right, you do it with one person. It's a lot easier to learn that than it is to try and do it with everybody. So that's why that relationship is so important. But I get pushback on this all the time. There's no one I can trust. And so my question to that is, what are you going to do? Because you can't build without them, right?
Yeah.
And there are two valid options. One is you learn the skills and you grow. The other is you recognize that's not actually something I want to work on. I was happier as a solopreneur with a couple helpers.
Sure.
If that's the case, go back, right? Yeah. Just like being on the plane, sometimes the nearest exit is behind you. Right. Another myth in all of this is that you have to move forward. You don't ever have to move forward. There's some truth to if it's not growing, it's dying, but it's not that your revenue is going up or it's dying. There's 1,000 different ways to grow. And so when we mistake the fact that you constantly have to be bigger, you constantly have to beat last year's revenue, you have to add people, you have to make $1 million a year, $10 million a year, $100 million a year. If you're borrowing someone else's goals for your life, you're going to be miserable no matter what stage you're in. So it's an opportunity for folks to when they face that pain, say, hey, is it actually worth it? Do I really need to grow this business beyond what I can do myself? Or can I be happy doing what I was doing before?
What a great way to end. Don't borrow someone else's goals. That is really powerful. I think that hopefully somebody listening today will be able to take that to heart. There's so much here that is awesome. I appreciate, Scott, all that you've been sharing. We could sit for hours and I could just keep talking. I want to be respectful of your time. So, one last question, I'm going to let you go. What would your tip of the day be for somebody listening? Maybe it's something that we covered. Maybe it's something still on your heart that someone needs to hear a word from you on that. But what would your tip of the day be for somebody listening today?
This is my tip of the day, all day, every day, probably for the rest of my life. And it's actually highly related to what we just talked about. So I want to set the stage a little bit. When I was 25 when we had our first son, and 2 years later we had our second son. And at 25, I loved them to pieces. I had no idea what to do with them. I wasn't to quit. I didn't know what to do. It was kind of like, and my posture those first couple of years of their life was give them back when they're 2, 3 years old and can kick a ball, right? We'll have a great time. I was there, but I wasn't there, right? I was waiting for something else to happen to really fully enjoy my sons. Well, fast forward about 10 years, whole lot of life and death and everything in between happens for our family. And at 35, I was a very different person than I was at 25. And we had our daughter when I was 35 years old. And I decided those first 2 years I wasn't going to let get away again. I still didn't really have a whole lot of idea what to do, you know what I mean? But I just knew I was going to get every bit of joy out of it that I possibly could.
Sure. Yeah.
And it was a bittersweet thing because I experienced more joy over that 2 years than probably the 2 decades before it. And while I love that, I realized what I missed as well with my boys early on. And the lesson that I learned from that is that joy does not come from a destination. Right? Joy doesn't come from reaching some milestone or your kids getting to a certain age. Joy is only ever found in the present. And I work with founders, for the context of our conversation, I work with lots of founders who are way past all of these days, right? And one of the most common things they say to me is, I wish it was like that again. Whatever problem you're experiencing in business right now, anyone listening, there's someone who's been through it, who's on the other side and would actually gladly have it again. It doesn't matter how hard it is. There is a joy that's available right here, right now, in this moment, in this stage that won't be available any other time. And so rather than waiting to seize it 5 and 10 years later and finding out you missed it all along, like I did with my kids, grab hold of the joy that's available to you today.
That's fantastic. I love that finish. Hey, listen, Scott, if this is burning in somebody's heart right now and they want to learn more about you, they want to understand more about Scale Architects, what's the best way for people to connect with you?
Yeah. I wish it was as easy as saying, look up Scott Ritzheimer on social media, because you'd think a name like that would be unique, but I'm a junior, right? So there's two of us. Pick the one who looks like he's 14, you'll get me. But a better way of doing this would be to head on over to scalearchitects.com. In fact, there, if you click on free book at the top of the website, it'll take you to a book that outlines all 7 stages. And in that closing point, it actually talks about the joy that's available in every stage. So if there's anyone out there who's feeling frustrated or stuck, or they don't understand what's going on, they're that reluctant manager like I was, or even if they're further down the road and they're facing the new challenges that come up, and you want to know how you can have more joy today, if you want to know how you can get to the next level faster and what you need to do right now, it's all in that book. It's all free at scalearchitects.com.
That's fantastic. So, the final word is, if you did not learn anything today, if you are still on that first spot in that map, it's totally okay. Re-listen to this. Don't jump into your next activity until you're able to really get with yourself and be able to walk away with some solid stuff. Scott has invested his life in this. Reach out to him. Re-listen to this, jump on scalearchitects.com and get your free book. But please do something. Don't just jump into your next piece, because all this is sitting there waiting for you. I've heard peace, I've heard trust, I've heard growth, I've heard all these great words. So thank you so much, Scott, for all you're doing. And I just can't wait to keep learning from you.
Thanks, Dave, for having me on. Just an absolute privilege and honor to be here.